Hello, thank you for joining our session today. My name is Debbie Reynolds. They call me the Data Diva. I am the CEO, founder, and Chief Data Privacy Officer of Debbie Reynolds Consulting. The topic we'll be talking about today will be solving for vendor management privacy gaps. And we have two excellent speakers. You guys will really enjoy this session. First off, we have Barbara Consgrove, who's the Chief Privacy Officer at Workday. Barbara is responsible for Workday's global privacy, data ethics, advocacy, and oversight. Barbara has extensive expertise in managing international data protection and compliance programs and implementing data governance policies, technology compliance programs, and privacy by design frameworks. And she has also served as a Chief Security Officer for Workday. Thank you, Barbara, for being here. And then we have Ben Brook, who's the CEO of Transcend. So he's the CEO and co-founder of Transcend, which is a data privacy technology company headquartered in San Francisco. Backed by Axel and Index Ventures, Transcend makes it simple for companies to give users control over their data and has built engineering solutions to chart the path forward for modern data rights. Prior to co-founding Transcend, Brook studied computer science, astrophysics, and neuroscience at Harvard University. Excellent. So without further ado, I would love to jump into to the session. I want to give just a brief overview. So this session, I think, is extremely important because people who are in privacy roles are tasked with, either evaluating software or figuring out how to navigate companies' issues, always have challenges with figuring out what are the right tools or the right techniques to use and what are the right vendors to use. So I guess I'll start with you, Barbara. What do you think is the vendor management privacy gap, and what challenges does that bring to organizations?
Thanks, Debbie. So when I think about the vendor privacy management gap, it really goes to, the days of companies having all of their data on premise, on servers, in their offices is long gone. It's been gone for some time. Companies have personal data that falls under privacy regulations and a wide range of systems that are managed by multiple vendors and different vendor types. So, whether it's, using a cloud vendor like Workday for your HR, financial planning data, and then having another vendor for your customer data, your marketing data, looking at, even vendors in terms of thinking back to days when we were going into offices regularly, how you were doing guest management as people came in and registering. There's a wide variety of different risks that go with these different vendors and different data categories that are going into it. And so the root of the issue comes down to really more of a fundamental privacy issue. It's knowing what type of data you have, what classifications you have for data, where is all of that data going, and how do you inventory it? And really coming up with some sort of risk management structure around it so that you can understand really how to keep track of all of them and oversight over it. I'm sure Ben has more to say in terms of the topic too. I don't know that we're seeing Ben yet, but he will be visible soon for us.
Yeah, I see Ben. Ben, do you have any thoughts on that?
On the vendor management privacy gap, I would echo what Barbara said. I think it's about having this huge set of vendors where we're tracking all types of data. It may be things like financial information, it could be HR data, it could be behavioral analytics, and even demographics information. And the vendor gap to me is something that is commonly underestimated, where when companies typically think about the data they're collecting, it's usually the data inside their own products. But there's this massive set of data which is equally important that is often overlooked. And part of that is because it's just such a difficult problem. They don't have as much domain over that information. They're entrusting a third party with it. And oftentimes it's not even visible to for example, Privacy Council, because the average mid-sized company will have upwards of 288 SaaS tools and vendors. And that means that there are different teams that have SaaS tools that they're not even aware of. And so just the extent of information that is being tracked into these tools is huge, and it's often overlooked. And so to me, that's what the vendor gap represents.
Okay, great. Well, Ben, I'd love to ask, what should data controllers be doing to stay compliant while using vendors? And what should data processors be doing to support their business customers?
Absolutely, yeah. So just quick terminology. I imagine pretty much everybody in the audience is familiar with the terminology there. Just data controller is typically the company who has the relationship with the user or data subject, and then data processor is a vendor who that company is using to manage that data. So for example, a transactional emailing service or an HR system like Workday would be a data processor typically. So as the data controller, you absolutely need to account for all of these vendors. And most of us are aware of the contracting process. So signing data processing addenda with your vendors, standard contractual clauses, and so forth. But I'll skip that part and kind of talk about what should happen after you've started working with the vendor. So the first thing is you need to understand the personal data that a vendor has about your data subjects. And then you actually also need to be able to govern that data. So this is typically a really challenging process. Like, as I said, there are hundreds and hundreds of vendors in any given company, and they're all managed by different stakeholders, different teams, and there's very low visibility there. And then on top of that, now there's hundreds of millions of consumers who have the right to submit DSRs, data subject requests, like the right to access or right to erase their personal data, which means that a privacy team in a company actually has to have the infrastructure in place to not only understand what that data is, but also to start governing the data across their vendors. So when people request deletion of data, that doesn't just extend to your own product data that's internally housed by your engineering team, but it's also all the data that's being collected by and sent to your vendors. So getting that infrastructure in place is really important for the data controller. And then on the processor side, the way that they can actually assist their customers who are the data controllers is by actually building APIs and ways of actually programmatically connecting into that information, so that if your customer has thousands of data subject requests coming in a day, that they have a way of actually operationalizing that without having to go on this sort of wild goose chase across all their vendors. So finding a way to enable your customers to actually govern their data inside your platform is essential.
I think privacy regulation has created more urgency around these problems. So these issues have existed in corporations for a long time, but now there is, because of regulation and possible fines, there's more fire under companies to try to solve this problem. So to me, it's kind of a double problem. It's kind of a information governance problem, and then there's the regulatory pressure to sort of get this right. What are your thoughts, Barbara?
Yeah, you're right. I mean, first and foremost, most companies should, just from a ethical perspective, want to be doing the right thing, right, with the data, and understand where it is and protecting it, knowing that some of this data is the most sensitive data there can be, and that you want to protect it. But there have been a lot of regulations implemented over the last 5 years, I would say, and we're continuing to see new privacy regulations, whether it's state by state, potentially federal, and around the globe coming up. So there's definitely even more of an incentive for companies to have a robust privacy oversight program and to be able to demonstrate that they are appropriately, analyzing risk, have vendor management in place, that it's not just a one-time onboarding, that there's regular oversight and reviews taking place. And a lot of companies, depending on the size of them, will already have some sort of a vendor management program, whether it's in a procurement program, a risk program, a security program, that, as a privacy team, you should really try to link into and build off of. There's different types of reviews taking place, but don't start from scratch if you can already hook yourself into an existing program. But then, yeah, it's really important now to make sure that you can demonstrate that you've analyze the risk, that you're doing regular reviews, that you're able to, leverage existing compliance documentation these companies may have. They might have robust ones, or if not, you're prepared to send some sort of assessment out and be able to do that sort of assessment if they don't have, standard SOC and ISO or compliance documentation to send to you. And again, it's not just because it's the right thing to do anymore. It's because there is a lot of regulation requirements on, especially the data controllers, to be demonstrating that they have this oversight over the processors.
Great. Ben, how are businesses typically coordinating DSAR requests, today?
Yeah, sure. So in general, a lot of companies will have, as the form of submission, will have an email inbox. So as a consumer, it's very typical to see a privacy policy where if you're looking to exercise one of these data rights, whether it's access or erasure or what have you, and you effectively have to go down to, like the 13th or the 14th section of the privacy policy, it will say what your legal rights are. And at the very bottom, it will say something like, if you want to exercise these rights, email us. And it'll be privacy@companyname.com typically. And there's actually very often a privacy lawyer sitting on the other end of that inbox, reading these emails, trying to turn them into something that's actionable. So interpreting them as access requests. And then when that's there, that's usually indicative of a fairly manual internal process for collecting the data as well. But as it relates to vendors, it's actually really interesting. There's effectively two camps in the sort of most common scenario. So in many organizations, there exists this privacy lawyer, the same one, who is also actually sending emails themselves to all of their vendors. And essentially this looks like a big BCC list saying, here are the data subject requests we've got. And those emails often will contain the personally identifying information of those data subjects who submitted the request. So it's a very manual process in the sort of typical scenario, and this clearly results in a pretty messy trail of personal data that is even harder to delete. And then furthermore, it's very hard to actually stay on top of whether that vendor did respond for this data subject and have auditability into any of that. So that's kind of camp one in the typical scenario. Camp two is a lot of businesses just frankly have not yet included vendors in their DSR processes, whether it's access or even erasure. It's such a challenging issue and so cumbersome for someone to manage that it's sort of just something that hasn't been addressed yet. And so clearly this is extra risky because analytics and marketing information is typically stored with these vendors, as well as all types of personal data, which I alluded to, like financial information. So it's sensitive data. And what's interesting is a lot of these vendors are the ones that power a lot of the communications with the end users. So I commonly see companies confirming to a data subject that they've in fact completed their erasure request, only for the data subject to get a marketing email the following day from one of their SaaS systems. So those are kind of the two camps I see, but the best companies will be integrated with their vendors at the systems level. So they actually connect directly into that vendor system and have direct base truth on the data and can actually operate and govern on it directly. So that's where we ought to be, but frankly, that's not what's yet typical.
Yeah. And I think a lot of companies, the way systems were built before a lot of these regulations was that the data would never be deleted, that you could keep it forever. So we're kind of trying to rethink it and sort of reverse engineer the way we think about data, especially because now consumers have rights to deletion and soon with the CPRA to actually edit their data. So Barbara, how do you get companies to consider prioritize privacy when selecting and onboarding vendors?
I don't know how many of you all heard Michelle Dennedy in the fireside chat earlier today, but I think she addressed this really well when she was talking about, could you imagine being at a company where they're about to select a new vendor or roll out some software, and 2 days before they went to the engineers and said, well, what OS are we going to use? And, you know, thinking of the delays that would be and what that would cause, and getting the business to really understand it's the same thing with privacy. If you're adding privacy in at the very last minute, you're going to be adding delays. You're not going to be efficient. By really building it in early on, getting it as one of the primary factors as you're doing your vendor selection, not as you're going to sign a contract, it really will make it an easier process for all. And I think by doing that, it's making sure that you're really training folks on it too, that it's not a, you have to pull 3 more people in and add a large assessment. Have the people who are doing some of that initial vendor assessment really understand what you care about and what the important factors are for privacy. So it's something that they can be asking early on. They understand it's not adding an extremely complex process in. Just the more you can get it to work with the existing processes and just work in those systems too, I think it makes it a much easier experience for everybody. And again, it makes the onboarding end up much faster, much more efficient, and privacy doesn't end up a blocker, but ends up a business enabler in the end.
Right. What do you think, Ben?
On vendor categorization, I would say it's important in general to just go a little bit beyond not only like the vendor assessment part is critical. The part that I like to focus on is the way that getting more to like a base truth, right? So this problem becomes very quickly untenable, in my opinion, where there are so many different systems and vendors to manage that it's a very imperfect process when we're working with, you know, questionnaires and interviews and sort of audits. And it's the status quo for sure, but I think we need to get into a place where there is a much closer to the metal implementation of actually having controllers closer to the data that they're storing so that they can see it, they can audit it, they can actually govern it. So in my opinion, I would just sort of broaden it a little bit to that as well.
So Ben, how does opt-in consent work when vendors are collecting data directly from data controller's website or app?
Yeah, so it's interesting. So a lot of vendors actually collect data directly from your user's device. So it's pretty typical to think of a vendor relationship as you having data in your company that you then send to a vendor, right? For whatever purpose. But very typically, vendors will be collecting directly from the user. So if a user arrives on your website, that tracking information or financial information, that does not go through your company. It goes straight from their computer to the and that means that in opt-in consent, companies actually have to have a method to prevent those technologies from collecting data prior to consent. And it's not just cookies. We use that term a lot, but there's so many different tracking technologies out there. And most of them are actually on every website. It's web beacons, it's fingerprinting, to name a few. But there are truly like dozens and dozens of different ways that this information is tracked. So you have to have a valve to shut off these data flows, that shut off the data collection for a specific user. But there's very little surface area to do this because you are not on the path as the company, right? From an architectural standpoint, you don't have that place to sort of turn off the valve. You have to actually have a complete data flow governance technology sitting on your website that can basically turn these valves on and off depending on user consent for specific types of data. And that represents a very challenging problem, whether it's on the website or the app, but this governance technology is starting to get a lot better here.
Right. And Barbara, as someone who kind of evaluates vendors for different things, products, how do you categorize vendors?
Oh, there's so many different ways to categorize vendors from a privacy perspective. Again, it goes back to, what type of data are they going to be collecting? Is this the vendor that's going to be coming on site to, water plants and take care of things? Or is this the vendor that you're going to be using, for much more sensitive information? Understanding, is it a controller relationship? Is it a processor relationship? Is it a sub-processor that's going to be out there? Is it a co-controller? Really going through and understanding what is the relationship with that vendor, what type of data is in place, and then understanding the maturity of their program, because you can't assume that the vendor that has the most sensitive data is necessarily your highest risk. If they're a vendor that has a well-established program that can demonstrate compliance, they actually might be much, much less risk than a company that has a smaller amount of data but can't, show you that they have a regular way of protecting it. So doing all of those assessments in terms of, again, what type of data is, where is the data from? Is it sensitive data? Is it health data? And their role in the relationship, that processor, service provider, controller, whatever you want to call it, depending on which country, which region we're talking about.
Excellent, excellent. Ben, I'm going to mix this question up a bit. So how does California's do not sell my personal information requirement impact vendor relationships? So that's for the CCPA. And then for the CPRA, since they're going to add do not sell or share my data, how does that impact vendor relationships?
Yeah, that's a really interesting one. So this is so fundamentally tied to the vendor relationship, because when you're selling or sharing, this is always with third parties who are basically vendors. And that's essentially what we're discussing in general. So any third party here often will meet these definitions for sale, and which is now broadening to share. So that's in particular for CCPA today. That's like often ad networks or enrichment technologies, for example, which will put your data subject's personal data onto a network that other third parties will benefit from. So for example, if you have an e-commerce website and someone clicks on boots, right? Other advertisers will now start placing ads for boots as well. So that will constitute sale of personal information by most interpretations. And that is actually going to continue broadening. And this actually gets back to the last question where, again, a lot of this tracking and a lot of this sale and sharing is happening direct from your customer's device directly to this third party. So again, it emphasizes this requirement to have these valves sitting on your website, which you can actually tweak and say, we're going to shut off this data flow. Or perhaps we're actually going to instruct the processor to not put this onto the network because maybe they have a slightly different way of doing this. So a great case in point is Google and Facebook ads. They have these parameters called limited data use. You can actually turn on these parameters for specific users who opt out of the sale of their personal information. And what that will do is it will continue collecting the data, but it will not put it onto the network for other third parties to benefit from. But that's a very hard problem, again, because it means that even in that scenario, every single event that you collect, or that the Facebook pixel or whatever tracking technology is on your website, every event that is collected has to be tagged appropriately with this governance parameter for this user. And so again, it begs this need for having technologies right on that website or app that actually can track the consent and be pretty smart about how to actually regulate at the event level. So an event being user clicked on this button, how to regulate right at that level of granularity in order to actually comply. And so these become exceedingly complex technology problems. And for engineering teams, this is a never-ending wild goose chase where they're just kind of going down and finding all these new specs from different vendors. And to have something that would harmonize that would be amazing. This is something that we focus on a lot, but it's a difficult problem, and it's definitely something that is at the heart of this vendor relationship. Does this meet that definition of sale? And if so, what do we even do when users request that, right? So it just adds another layer of complexity, both at the sort of management level with your vendors, but also at the engineering and technical level.
Yeah, so basically it's almost like you're trying to swim upstream or you're adding a valve to that sort of decision point where before it was kind of a highway where people go straight through. Now it's saying, at this point that an individual has made a decision, let's check to see if it, comports with, the regulation or what we want to do with that data. So that's definitely a hard problem. And I think we'll continue to see companies try to find ways to make that um, more smooth in terms of how technology handles this data. And also we're seeing companies like, Google or Apple or, trying to find ways to sort of stop that data flow at that point and sort of insert those valves or insert those decision points. Barbara, what are some of the steps to keeping internal privacy documentation up to date as you continue to onboard new vendors?
As you look at your data privacy and your data inventory, I think a lot of companies, when GDPR went into place, did a massive exercise around this. I think most of the people listening to this know what GDPR is, but so when obligations came in place in terms of really having to demonstrate that you knew where your data was and how it was, companies went through, and for many companies, this was a very manual exercise. Everybody went through, they did interviews, they had some technical ways of identifying where data was in certain systems, but a lot of it was also just interviews across the organization. All of this data got thrown into spreadsheets. And the problem is the spreadsheets then sit, but people keep adding new features to systems that were already there, using new data sources, adding new vendors, and they quickly get out of date. And so even if you're going and trying to do that manual update, on an annual basis, a quarterly basis, you're just not going to have a great idea of where your data is. And so while, coming up with systems automation is key, having technical solutions around that, I think one of the easy things companies need to do to at least try to make sure that they're catching it as new systems are coming on is making sure that that onboarding system really is connected into that data inventory. So as you're going through that vendor selection process, you're making sure that you understand what data is going to be going into that system, where it's going, what the access controls are, and right then taking that as an opportunity to either, if your company is still doing this manually, make sure that you have that tie-in somehow, that automatically will get linked in to your data categorization, into your data inventory, and update it then. Or, ideally have some sort of more automated tooling where you can then have it go in. But if it ends up being something where you're just doing that whole assessment and not tying those two processes together, it's just impossible to ever keep that up to date and accurate. And you're just always going to be going back to really, step zero before step one, even, to keep it up to date.
Yeah, I think people, when they start out in the Excel route, once they get, a little deeper in the process, they realize that this is not going to work. The things you're trying to track and the things you're trying to update are a lot more complex than that. And that's, to me, the strength of some of these privacy tools, where it helps kind of automate some of that stuff. Obviously, they need the input from the customer to be able to put this data in, but being able to have sort of that tracking, or what I consider like a more three-dimensional view of your data, it really makes your ability to sort of track things and comply with regulations a lot easier. What are your thoughts, Ben?
Yeah, couldn't agree more that it can get pretty chaotic really quickly. These companies are moving so fast and changing their vendors so quickly that it can be, for some companies, it's like within a week, an assessment could be out of date, right? And not only that, but even in any given vendor, it may change. Like the data that's being collected could expand over time or fundamentally change without necessarily changing, without necessarily having to go through procurement again. And so it's very easy for that to fall out of sync. And I think as an industry, we need to get to a place where we're enabled to get closer to base truth. So it's very, very, very difficult right now, where we're using all of these proxies of like what are effectively questionnaires, right? And audits and things that are not actually looking at the reality of the data. And so I think we're like, as an industry, we're sort of in this like MV state where we have stuff that's like kind of working right now, but also definitely not scalable and like definitely not something that feels like it's really working. And I think the sort of the V2 that we have to get to is a place of infrastructure where we see the base truth of what's happening with these vendors. We can connect to them directly. We're able to actually understand what data is being tracked. When it changes, we know instantaneously. And we're able to like change that if we have to. So if it falls out of our policies or even our DPA or something, we should be aware of that. And right now it's just so fuzzy and like it's like a very chunky reporting process right now. And so I think we're getting closer to that. And I think it's getting a lot easier to actually get that infrastructure in place. So, you know, obviously we're an infrastructure company that focuses on this problem. But I think there's a lot of great technologies coming out in this space in general. And I think that it's going to become more and more available to just any kind of company. So I think the price will eventually come down and it will be available to like SMBs, and like everyone should be able to actually just have a simple way of managing all these vendors and just understanding where they're at with this sort of like data sprawl that's occurring.
I'd also add, you know, you touched on this point, which I think is really fascinating to consider, is the way that your company is handling data today may change tomorrow. Let's say your company acquires another company or adds a different service or wants to go into a different country. Being able to have a tool that has, you know, a lot of this information in it, you're not recreating the wheel whenever those changes happen. What are your thoughts, Barbara?
Yeah, I think companies have to build flexible programs, agile programs. Again, you know, have a program that really is able to focus and look at risk. Not to keep saying it, not to be a broken record, but I think all of this comes down to really having a, you know, thorough way of understanding where your risk lies so you can prioritize, you know, which controls you need to have in place, what vendors you have to do more oversight on, what types of questions you're asking. And again, you know, as Ben was talking, there's a lot of differences in how you're looking at a B2B relationship in terms of, you know, what type of oversight, what type of documentation you're looking for, how you're asking questions around data, because as a company, you may have a lot more control over that data, over what's going in, more responsibilities on yourself, and you're looking at more, you know, higher level security programs and data transfers and amendments, versus when you're using perhaps some more of the consumer applications where you're having to really go into some more of these data flow controls that you were talking about too. And so just making sure that you've built a program that you're continuing, it's not just a one-time thing, that you have continual operational controls, checkpoints where you're going to catch things as they change, in a way, again, that just has to be agile, that has to be able to move quick so that you don't hinder the business. Because if you start slowing down the business, you're not going to get pulled in when you need to be. So you have to have these just very flexible controls, checkpoints that can prioritize the risk and bring you in at the right points in time.
Correct. I agree with that. So, Barbara, are there any assessments to ask for from a global perspective that can help demonstrate compliance with these changing requirements?
I'll focus on that maybe a bit more from the B2B perspective in terms of looking at what type of assessments. You know, ideally we would have a approved code of conduct to demonstrate GDPR compliance, and hopefully someday we will have one. But asking if the companies have any type of code of conduct, asking if they have various ISO certifications. Do they have any of the ISO privacy certifications? Do they have a SOC 2 audit report? Does that include privacy in addition to security and confidentiality? And not just, I shouldn't say asking, reading it. You know, you want to make sure that as you ask your vendor for their SOC audit, for their third-party documentation, that it's not documentation that just covers a data center as opposed to their actual controls for how they might onboard, train their workforce, protect data. But those are a few of the ones I'd start with. I'd also, to the extent they have binding corporate rules or something like that that goes into the details of their privacy program, I think that is always a great one to be able to, get a bit in the weeds in terms of how the program works. Those would be the ones I would start with from a B2B. Would be really the SOC, the ISO, and then looking for any BCRs or code of conducts as well.
Okay. What is your ask this to Ben? Let's see. What is your temperature read on how well companies are thinking about future proofing their privacy efforts when looking at vendors versus scanning the market for a regulation specific solution?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So future proofing to me means that, so the future, first of all, is going to be a lot more laws, right? I think we can all agree that the future is more compliance, more complexity, regional differences, and just sort of a compounding degree of complexity. And so when looking at vendors, you have to be confident in their privacy program that they're on top of it, right? Like, if it's super specific, or if it's just frankly marketing copy, then it's not going to be able to stay up to date, and it's going to be very hard for them and for you to stay compliant as this all changes. So when future proofing, I would definitely look for signals on a strong privacy program. Something that is often a very good signal that they actually offer specific like deletion flows or opt-out flows. Some companies will actually have a feature saying like, here is like, we have interpreted the law as like, this is the button you click, or the API route that you'll send a request to, and we'll run that erasure in our SaaS tool for this user. I think that's a great signal that they are that they're thinking about this. Not everyone can do that though. Some tools are more arbitrary with their data, and they can't run that for you. But I think nonetheless, it's a good signal to see that they are advising their companies in their developer documentation, for example, on how to actually run these workflows within their platforms. So I would think about it that way, and then of course, like this all comes down to the data controller actually having the infrastructure in place to do this. So to truly future proof, we have to get to that V2 that I was talking about, which is we're getting closer and closer to the base truth of this information. And we're starting to get into the place where we can actually govern this data in ways that are flexible enough that if there's a new requirement, like the next sort of do not sell, which is a fairly specific opt-out choice, that we're ready for that. So yeah, a flexible infrastructure is critical.
That was an excellent question from Melody Ensign, by the way. Before we wrap up, I want to make sure that I get both you all to answer this last question, which is, and I'll start with you, Barbara. What immediate actions can businesses take right now to bridge the data privacy vendor management gap?
A first immediate step, it depends on the maturity of the program, of course. If a company hasn't done it, really making sure that you know who your vendors are. That's key. Understand who you're using as a vendor and what data that they have. And then I'd immediately follow that with really coming up with that risk framework so you can understand, where to prioritize your efforts and make sure that you're doing more regular reviews. But the very first step, make sure you really truly understand where all the vendors are. And that itself can be a daunting task for many companies to really understand that.
Great. And Ben, to you next. What immediate actions can businesses take today to bridge the data privacy vendor management gap?
I would say build or buy data privacy infrastructure. This is the way to actually plug into every vendor and actually see the data, manage it completely, and it will totally transform the privacy program when you have this, and that's the way you would erase it, I would say. So build or buy, and yeah, that's something we focus on, but there are many other ways to do it. You can build it in-house and sort of work with your vendors to actually connect up into their systems as well.
Yeah. One last word I would probably make is that I think companies sometimes get overwhelmed with all the privacy regulations and things like that. Make sure you understand sort of your business and your business type, because not every law is going to apply to you. So instead of looking at it as sort of the big bad bear, definitely just drill down into what your organization's actually doing to see what things apply to you, and then it won't seem so daunting. Let's see, I would like to say, thank you to Barbara Consgrove, and thank you to Ben Brock for this session. I think it was really great, especially as people are sort of in these jobs and we're sort of navigating this new frontier. It's really good to hear people who have this sort of insider experience, because these things really help people on a day-to-day basis. Excellent.
Thank you, Debbie.
Thanks, Debbie.
All right. Thank you, everyone.